actually function today.
Yep.
You ready to go?
Alrighty.
Okay.
But
We'll
they would
stand and
still
say the
be able to
pledge.
do that. Whoops.
Yeah.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning again. Let's see. First on the agenda is a proposed ordinance for the regulation of the sale of ingestible products.
Mr. Chair, the county attorney is not going to be available till 9:45 or 10 o'clock,
Okay?
so I would suggest that we pull that item until the end of the meeting.
Sure. Move on to committee reappointments.
And this is really just kind of a housekeeping note, and knowing that we have this work to do between now and January 5th when we do our, or January, first Tuesday in January, whatever day that is this year. These are the appointments that we have to be considerate of, and also the Commissioners Committee list. And obviously, we have to get through an election today before we know exactly what we're doing with this, but this is our homework for the next 6 weeks, so that when we come to the organizational meeting in January, we can make all those decisions.
Okay. I know on the list here, you've got North Country Community Health Board. I've already spoke with April Coleman, and she would like to return.
Okay, so my ask on this would be that you would just communicate these things with Denise directly during the
Okay.
course of the next 4 weeks, so we can put that together and have that ready to go for the first Tuesday in January.
Alrighty?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
being that I won't be here, first meeting in January, just like to convey, I would like to be on MRC if possible at all. It's not, I really enjoy that committee.
We could, but we
Be
could
an
all
alternate-
be on
Either a
MRC.
delegate or an alternate, that
Yeah.
would be nice. But whatever, just wanted to make that request if it's possible.
Yeah, normally we have the board chair as
Yeah.
the voting member, and then the rest of us can be alternates or delegates.
I think we voted on per diems.
We voted on per diems for all of us to
Oh, okay.
attend, and so if the board chair isn't going to be there, then he can let us know and appoint one of us to vote.
Sounds good. One of you will be at the 14th.
I'll be there
one,
on
right? Yeah.
Monday.
Yeah. And I already RSVP'd Julie Rain. But I just talked with Char this morning on the possibility if I can't make it, I'd let her know
Yeah,
Sunday.
good. Make sure one of the board members is there, yeah.
So then if we can move on from there, the capital plan update and budget updates all kind of roll together. But one item that we need to have a conversation about is the solid waste fees, the proposed fees, and the preliminary proposal. So Josh, I don't know if you want to come up front. The preliminary proposal was to ask for $800,000 in ARPA funds for landfill closures for 2023. And I think that number has come down a bit, but we don't have ARPA funds left. And then the funds that we have left are the Enbridge funds that are being collected for 2023. And we really haven't had a conversation about how to use those. In the capital plan that I sent out, there was a list of 2023 current needs. And if I throw this over here. Then I can show you a little bit. We can talk about the policy on the proposed capital plan policy, but my intention was to kick that over to general government after the regular meeting next week.
Okay.
And work through the policy portion of it. But for today's conversation and getting some sort of an idea about what to do relative to levy funding and specifically solid waste funding, I think we needed to have a little bit of a conversation about these items. So on the top of this table, there's the economic development fund balance, and our goal was to allocate money towards economic development out of that Enbridge fund. I have not identified projects in there. We know that we had projects from the ARPA committee that we did a year and a half ago, right, a year ago. And I don't know if we want to populate this with that list, or if we need to meet and review and take a look at that. But we need to have that conversation before we decide how much money is available for 2023 capital needs. When I look at the levy summary that you've seen, so there's several major things that are relying on that. One is this public safety, the radio upgrades, the Phoenix software, and jail planning are all capital items that have been pulled out of the regular budget and put in the use of levy and the use, or not the use of levy, the use of fund balance. And the use of fund balance is the use of Enbridge capture. Recorder's archiving project has, you can see it's blue and blue, they have a source of funds available. We're planning on doing a bid in December or January for the courthouse roof replacement, but you can see that also has its own source of funding. But Deep Lake Park demo and then this landfill closure are the other things that are the primary things that don't have funding. So if we were to look at that list, we have more funding requests than we have funds available from that source for this first year. I've had a conversation with Scott and Corey about this software, if this is something they need to do this year, that they have some dedicated 911 funds and some other funds that are available to pay for part of this software. They're only budgeting part of this software to come from levy or fund balance. But we'll have to make that determination before we, and then the Deep Lake Park, the demo and the engineering for the next year, there is no source of funding other than fund balance for that. And the first bite of fund balance would come off of that. So in relation to solid waste, Josh put together, I think, a very detailed and good capital plan that takes into account their annual equipment needs, their building needs over the next 10 years, and then landfill closures that he's aware of through working with their engineering contractor to make sure that we have those numbers in there. And we had a brief conversation last Friday about sources and uses. And one of the items that we have to have a policy discussion on is whether we're going to pay for all costs out of solid waste with solid waste fees, or if we're going to have other additional sources of funding for that. Now, Josh's hope was that there was going to be additional source of funding for this first closure that was, I don't know when it was ordered and when it's due and when it's overdue, but I mean, we're in that point where we're getting towards non-compliance when we don't have this piece of work done out there. If we don't have a source of funding for that, we end up burning fund balance. And if we don't want to burn fund balance, then we have to raise the solid waste fees pretty significantly above what the proposal was in September when Josh first came forward to you with a 19% increase on.
14% commercial and 19% residential.
19% residential, 14% commercial. Another thing has changed since then is we've adjusted our numbers relative to labor in factoring in the cost of the implementation of the classification system in addition to the cost of living. And that has added some operational costs to countywide. So that's one of the things. So in my mind, when I look at, we have an operating shortfall of about 180,000 in solid waste. And we have, is it 650,000 that you think it's gonna be for cost next year, Josh, if you were to approve the project? Or is it still closer to 8?
Well, there's kind of three separate projects. The first priority project is doing about 3.8 acres of cover on the south landfill, and that engineer's estimate was $510,000. The second portion of that was doing a temporary cover over part of that landfill, and that was, I think, $130,000. And the other portion that I included in there was doing a cover project at the north landfill, which wouldn't necessarily have to be done next year.
Okay.
So Josh, if, you spent the $130,000 for the temporary, then you would have to replace that with a permanent down the road.
Yep,
And this is part of a corrective action plan?
correct, yep.
That's from the MPCA or?
Yep, so it was tied with our re-permitting of the landfill, which was, I think, approved in 2019. Well, actually 2018 or 19, I can't remember which, but, and we developed a corrective action plan, and this was the steps outlined, to address the groundwater concerns in the area, so.
And it's something that's important that we at least get started on.
I would say the first initial phase of final cover is the biggest step that we really should get started on.
Okay, and that'd be the 500.
Yep.
So what would happen if we funded half of it out of this year and put it off until next year?
So I'm showing where is this gonna go? So I asked Josh to show a couple of different options. And this is the sheet that he was working off of, earlier this year in September. The 2022 rates are in this column. The proposed rates are in this middle column. And then, we're showing two additional numbers, one to carry the additional operating expense, and one to take that $600,000 approximately over 3 years and add, capturing $200,000 for closings per year to this fund. That would probably be my recommendation, is that we would have a capital fund within 52. Because Fund 52 is really supposed to operate as an enterprise fund and should be able to be sufficient from the fees that it's generating relative to that. But we could phase this over a couple of years. Now, what we would end up doing is you could either fund it, if you collected $200,000 in '23 for this purpose, and you needed to spend 600, you'd spend 600, but you'd spend it out of 52 fund balance. And then in '24 and '25, when we don't anticipate having those expenses, you would pay it back into those fund balances. Now, we need to actually take a look. The October 31st fund balance in that fund was just over $2 million. And as Josh mentioned, that's a point in time. And you really want to look at a history, like we do with social services fund balance, and make sure that that's actually there. Because from January 1 from now until May, they're using that fund balance to cover their operating expense, right? That's why we have fund balance to cover operating expense till we get our May tax disbursements.
So, Mr. Chair, the reason I proposed trying to do it in increments like Jeff is talking about, I don't want to take all of the Enbridge money and spend it within the county on county expenses. I want it to benefit the entire county. And so somehow, I want money to come up with for economic development.
I agree. I mean, that was like, we were thinking with the ARPA funds.
I know.
Would help out, and then the nets had to be used elsewhere. It's
And there's-
disappointing, because we knew there was need.
There's an advantage to doing that. The fact that any money you spend on economic development, if you're doing the right things, that pays you back.
And
You
it
increase-
benefits
you
all kinds
increase
of
tax
business.
capacity.
Yep.
If we spend that money that was supposed to be roughly what we were thinking was part for economic development, part for capital improvement, if you pour it all into county things, that's not helping you with growth at all. It's not gonna pay you back except here inside the government. You know, if we expend some economic development and build help with a housing project as an example, which is a dire need in the county, that's gonna pay back tenfold. So I would like to see us make a commitment, or at least for the first 3 or 4 years until we get the economic development funding where we want it, that a portion of that money be earmarked for that. The rest can go to the capital. And then what we're gonna have to do is figure out in our capital improvement plan that maybe you can't spend $400,000 on radios, bam. Maybe you gotta spread it out over 3 years.
Yep.
You know, maybe we gotta do a little more creative thinking that way instead of just having this stuff be sprung and then spending it all in 1 year. Which has a long-term benefit too, because when those radios start to get tired and their useful life is expired, you don't have to do that same thing again where you're buying 100% of them in one swath. You can phase it over 2 or 3 years, and it just smooths the road for your planning.
So related to, I think we want to have that conversation, and I got a couple of different recommendations. Either we take it up at general government, or we kick it over to HLDC and say, what are the projects that need funding that make sense countywide, and kind of work with that. But if we look at this, and I completely get, Josh offered that this is a big increase from 158 to 188 for a residential solid waste assessment. And then you can see the proposed to carry the full operating would be 198, and we'd be at 211 for, if we actually look forward to the next 5 years worth of capital costs and believe that we would have enough in that fund to cover it from the fees that are generated. Now, the rest of the fees would be adjusted accordingly as well. I'm just concentrating on the residential assessment.
So I agree, that's a huge increase. However, in a neighboring county, someone I know went with a load, and one load was $200. So even at the high mark of $211 for the year, it's still one of the best bargains around.
I paid $5 this last weekend for every load of brush I brought into another county. You know, $20. So, and it's still a good value. And being that it was originally set up to be an enterprise fund, we probably should try to treat it as an enterprise fund so the taxpayer can see exactly what it costs to run this enterprise fund. If we constantly mix the levies around, it kind of gets lost on what the true cost is.
Josh brought up another option too, to leave the fee where it is, and then have that cover refuse and recycling, and then charge like other counties do for the other services. And I completely get that. But
That's like a no.
but I had heard from many of you individually that you really like the way that our customer service is, and that everything, that all the fees are inclusive when somebody comes through the gate if they're a Hubbard County resident.
I think it also adds to, would have to maybe have added staff, because now
Yes.
all of a sudden you have to start charging, and somebody's got to be taking care of,
Yeah.
okay, what's that load and what's it going to cost? And you know, I'll take the money, here's your receipt.
Another tidbit of my experience this last weekend is that exact thing. There wasn't enough personnel out there to deal with that, so you would pull up, bring your trailer in, and nobody was there. You'd sit 5 minutes and nobody was there. So you'd go dump your thing, and by the time you came in for the third load, oh, by the way, you need to pay for that. And you need to pay for the last loads again. Well, that doesn't really sit very good with the taxpayer when they find out after the fact.
So one very,
Yeah.
very big policy thing here is if we do make an adjustment, even the adjustment that was proposed from 158 to 188, Josh and his staff are gonna get a lot of public comment on that.
They are.
Right? And we need to share that burden with him, regardless of what we do here. But I do think it makes sense to go somewhere between the two new proposed, to make sure that we're gonna cover those costs, because I've heard from you that you don't wanna use the Enbridge funds to pay for that kind of a project within the county. We do have the ability to set those fees to cover those costs. It's a big jump, but it's $50 a year. It's $4 a month.
So maybe talking points then will have to be worked up. So your staff is gonna get a lot of flack, but if people understand that if they go to a neighboring county and they bring in a trailer load of stuff one time, it's $200. We're spoiled. You know, we've had this for how many years, and so people need to be refreshed on the value that they're getting. And if you look around our county, there's not a lot of ditches where I'm seeing appliances and garbage because people don't want to haul it in, because they have the convenience already of knowing they can just haul it in, because they've already paid for it.
So I'd like to maybe use some of the Enbridge capital funds. And then also maybe increase the fees. Maybe a compromise instead of the,
Can you go back to that last one, Jeff, and I'll just kind of maybe give my thoughts on it?
Yeah, I definitely want to make sure that Josh has an opportunity to speak here.
the 211 be the 198, that's still a $45 jump in 1 year.
So my initial thought of, well, I guess this whole expense, the cover expense, especially this first portion, really came up with our last permit. So it's not, wouldn't have had to plan for this major expense going back 20 or 30 years. It's kind of a new thing. Now we have to put a synthetic liner on, or cover on our landfill, which is, is why this expense is so high. To me, it would have been nice maybe to look back and spread that out over many years, and we could have avoided this issue. So to put that whole first project on, the assessment over the next couple of years I think is a little bit too much of a burden for our solid waste assessment. Well, I guess looking at that middle option, that would account for our other increases and would be putting money into our capital plan for future landfill costs. So that middle option would, we'd still be requesting the first, this first chunk of money, and it could be spread out through the Enbridge dollars over, 2 or 3 year period and paid back maybe to ease in what we'd need in the first year. But if we went with that middle option and had some of that additional tax capacity dollars, we're planning to, for the next 10 years and what we currently have in our landfill, planning for all the closure costs in our current assessment here. So we wouldn't necessarily, with closure costs, have to go to that top increase if we did that. Of course, that isn't, doesn't account for additional tip fee increases and stuff that's out of our control. But just, that middle option is allowing us to get planned for future capital needs, minus this first project, so.
And if we look, part of the conversation we had on Friday, if we look at the increasing costs of providing these services, solid waste is going up as fast as healthcare, right? So a 3% increase in solid waste fees is probably not gonna cover it under current economic conditions, with the cost for recycled materials or the price of recycled materials going down and the cost of hauling stuff going up. This is gonna be a very, it's gonna be a moving target for the next several years, and it might always be.
We may have yearly increases.
Well, we do have the option for yearly increases, but we have to be realistic about them, that a 2 or 3% increase is probably not gonna cover it when our cost for transportation, vehicle maintenance, are going up. The amount of money, revenue that we're getting from selling those recycling streams is going down. We have the same situation. So this is gonna be a relatively volatile market. And yeah, I mean, I honestly think the truth is somewhere between these two new numbers that Josh proposed here. I'm not entirely sure. We'd have to take a look at it, and we'd have to run some actual numbers. I'm not sure that at a 198, we're actually setting enough money aside against future needs, and we'd still have to fund the current proposed cover. And I don't know if it's worth taking one bite or taking 2 bites, right, or 3 bites to get to that point. That's a policy decision on your end, but. So anyway, we wanted to make sure that we had that conversation with you and take a look at it, and for a couple of reasons, the proposed 188 in September is not gonna be sufficient to carry the day and is gonna have a negative impact on 52 fund balance in '23.
My frustration with some of this, Mr. Chair, is we made a commitment to use Enbridge money for not only capital improvement, but some economic development. We've already had a year where the community has a need for housing. We were gonna use ARPA funds for some of that, we had hoped to. Government took all the ARPA funds. Now here we are in a situation where we have some Enbridge funds, we have the potential to do something. And is government gonna take all of next year's Enbridge funds? At what point are we gonna make a conscious decision on which direction we want it to go and make it happen, instead of just reacting? And my fear, maybe we should start with the argument of how much of that Enbridge money would you like to see go towards economic development, and then work it backwards.
And I would very much like that direction. The questions that I'm hoping that we get some clarity on today are relative to solid waste financing, taking a look at the 2023 planned capital expenditures, and then identifying what your allocation of that $1.6 million annually, what you want that to be. Do you want that to be in current economic development, current capital, or saving it for future capital needs? And there's enough money there to say a third, right? And still have a significant impact. Although I know that there's one big infrastructure project in the economic development front that would use that chunk of money once. And then that one.
So, Mr. Chair, because I'm on the HLDC board and the HRA board, the city of Park Rapids has committed funds to doing the preliminary work with the engineers to, for the infrastructure, that large infrastructure. We already know we're short on housing. The HRA is looking for money to do housing rehab, so that portion would benefit the entire county for people that way. In the HRA board meetings, we've talked about, we could actually build one or two, although financially we're not in position to do that, but we could put up 1 to 2 more apartment houses with the same size today, and they would be full, because there isn't anywhere to live. And in the HLDC meeting, we've talked about if we can get the infrastructure in there, so people don't have specials, then that makes affordable housing, and we can have different levels of housing as far as prices go.
I know the one project we were discussing with HLDC, at the time, we were talking $200 and some odd thousand for an average home, starter home.
Yes, I think so.
So
But-
now we'll be looking at, with inflation, is it $300,000 or $275?
I don't believe so, Ted.
So then
They're
who-
talking also about twin homes and then multifamily housing, and so I know it's gone up, but Mary still is trying to keep it under the $200,000 mark.
Because I'm thinking, what are the jobs available in the area that are gonna pay a wage high enough so they can afford to buy a new home like that?
Yeah.
So that we may
So
have to
we
do
have-
some alternative kind of housing, like you say, apartments or,
Well, and they're looking at all different levels of housing in that. It's not just all or nothing. But I do know, and I don't know the businesses, because that's confidential until it becomes public knowledge, but Mary's had inquiries, and even businesses that want to move in and bring employees, their own employees, so they would move here. And they've had it's not an option, because they don't have anywhere for their employees to live.
Another question in all this too, just imagine for a minute, if there was no Enbridge money captured, how would you deal with this?
We put a lot of
Why
things on
should
hold.
why should we treat it all that much differently, you know?
good point.
We don't have the money now. We need to actually build a fund up before we can actually start spending it.
Yeah.
Do we have anything else for Josh? Or do we have any more questions about those proposals? I think we'll have to come back to making a final proposal, but I think the number is going to be somewhere between that 20 to 33%.
When are you thinking of holding the public hearing?
It'd be in December.
Yeah, okay.
So we'll have to, if you have feedback on, just a straw poll now would kind of give us an idea. Do we just want to cover the operating expenses, or do we think we need, Josh is saying that over the next 8 to 10 years, and if you look at his numbers, and that's the other one I was going to pull up. You can see, and this is a bad copy, but you guys got it too, his equipment is averaging $400,000 a year for capital equipment, so that's an easy number to put in the budget. The buildings, we have different numbers here, and we really don't have a fund to deal with building needs going forward. And the closing, the next closing is out here in past 2028. Otherwise, this is the big hurdle to get over this year, this first $700,000 or $800,000.
What's the 1.5 million for buildings?
That was penciled in there because we were going to do a major remodel at the recycling building that we pushed off. And that was to replace or do a major remodel in that building, so.
Okay.
So-
I like your idea of, you'd have to get a look at the fund balance history for
We need-
several years, so we
Yep.
can know if we can use the fund balance to float us until the assessments come in to cover the cost. If we can do that for a year or two,
In the financial management plan, we'll blend operating, capital, and debt service for all the funds when we get that done. But as we look, I mean, we can make the representation that this covers our landfill closures if we go to the middle step for the next 8 years, but it doesn't take a bite at all out of our building needs. So we have to kind of have that conversation. And that's why I think at the general government meeting, when we look at the capital planning policy, one of the policies we're gonna wanna have a conversation about is solid waste as an enterprise fund and its capital needs and how we align that, and how we structure that. So, and we don't have to bite that all off this year, but I do think we need to bite off at least to cover the operational costs. And then have a plan for how are we gonna cover that payment. But I would hope by next week I could get a few years' history. Do you have a few years' history on the fund balance? Do you have those reports handy, or do I need to get them from Sandy?
I mean, yeah, I guess it's really hard to, again, paint that picture, it's, to me, just looking at, since we, paid for the transfer station project and looking how much money we, month by month, how much we have and how much we need to get to the next assessment period. Right now, in my budget that I've shared with all you guys is, as my view of it is we only have about 200,000 in there. I mean, really.
Everything else is operating money between levy periods.
But I could be wrong, and it's worth taking another kind of a
Yep.
deeper dive
Okay.
into that, but. Because I think the rest is just, we need to have that in the fund
Yep.
balance to carry our operating expenses.
Right, and I'm gonna share that with, I'm gonna share that when we get to a general conversation about the levy and overall items, but. So I think at the general government, we're gonna have to take a look at that history, and then make some recommendation relative to, what we're gonna bring forward for the solid waste fees for 2023.
it isn't much different than short-term bonding. I mean, if you have the cash flow to do it, you're basically doing it to yourself. It's just you have to make sure you got a healthy enough fund balance to do it.
If you have a healthy enough fund balance that you can pay for the improvement in 1 year and then pay your fund balance back for the next 5 years, it's essentially a 0% interest loan, right? Otherwise, there are low or 0% interest loans through MPCA or other providers that would allow us to help do that, and then we wouldn't have to cover the cost in the first year. We would borrow for that cost. And if we have the fund balance and the ability to do it, it's easier to do it in-house. But if we don't, then those tools make sense. They're typically not grant, and they're typically not forgivable. They're just low or no interest loans to cover those costs. So that's another conversation we could have relative to that, and that would help get us over the hump.
Yeah, in the future, the projects, building projects and kind of what we're getting into with our landfill, the next step of landfilling, are probably gonna be tied a lot to, state bonding dollars too, so, right now, I think it's kinda hard to really know how much we're looking at needing to have for even the recycling remodel or a new recycling office building space, but.
So anyway, I wanted to make sure that we had that conversation because that funding relative to the 52, the solid waste fund, I think needs to be addressed separately from the general funding and the general levy. I haven't seen, no, we wouldn't see him yet. Other questions or comments? Josh, can you make the meeting next Tuesday, the general government one? Okay, I think we throw that on that agenda and try to come up with a recommendation out of that to bring to the board ahead of our schedule.
In quick summary, then, I think, if we were to come up with, how much of that Enbridge funding we wanted to go to economic development, then we can work this backwards. And maybe there will still be some capital that we can throw at that. Maybe there won't be, but then that'll give us clarity on what we have to do with the fees.
There's a thought of having a formula for the first year or two, 3, and then perhaps we, can expand the economic part in the future.
Yeah, 'cause if you're fortunate enough, after 3 to 5 years, you'll have enough of an economic development fund, no matter what tools you use there, whether it's RLF, it somewhat self-supports itself to a large degree, that you would have to dedicate less and less money to that area. And more could go to capital.
And part of the model would be filling in these numbers in 23 through 28 and just identifying what portion of that we're gonna allocate and which projects we wanna get to and what kind of fund balance you would end up carrying.
And those would be projects we know about.
And those would be projects we know about or projects we could, whether they're capital for the county or whether they're economic development needs that we're aware of. I know one of the big things that several of the board members have talked about was funding a housing redevelopment program locally, right? And that would be something that Mary could easily do through HLDC if we identified a funding source. And as Commissioner Delahunt mentioned, you seed that with $250,000 and that goes a long way. And if it gets used up, you're happy to put more at it, right? Because that's something that's adding value. Each one of those economic development things add to tax capacity,
Yeah.
right? And that's what our levy is dependent on going into the future. New housing hit is the biggest impact on that. Infrastructure that allows for commercial development is a big win on that. But housing redevelopment, owner-occupied housing redevelopment is also a big win because they just maintain, the value of the property over time.
One last comment for clarity, how I'm thinking about this is if you take an example like Josh's comment, he said if he had to do 500,000 this year, okay, then the others shifted into next year a little bit. If you do the same thing with the radios, if you did a third of it this year, there's $300,000 of the money from the Enbridge funding, and another 300 that's shifted on Josh's capital that can be used for something else. And then next year comes along, and you've got a fresh $1.6 million. And the next year comes along, and you got another 1.6, and but if you keep doing what we're proposing to kind of do this year, will you ever get where you want to be?
That was the point I was gonna bring up. If we don't make this a priority this year.
You'll just keep
then
pushing
it's-
it off.
Yep. And so I don't know if the board knows this, but one of the local schools is actually exploring 2 things. One is putting up housing for their teachers, and secondly, trying to figure out how to provide childcare. And so I would challenge the board that we need to be creative in how we're gonna contribute to economic development too. I'm not interested in building government bigger. I wanna be able to benefit the entire county.
And that's not to say that these aren't the
No,
real
I'm not
needs. They're
saying
real
that either.
needs.
They are
It's
needs.
just how do we do that in the confines of the government funding without taking new dollars
Yep.
to do it? Some of that's
Because if we didn't
fine.
have those dollars, we'd have to plan differently.
That's right.
Yes.
So you take the money out of your right pocket or your left pocket?
Yeah. And by not doing economic things, we're actually making our life more difficult in the future.
Yes, we are.
If we do the right things on that, tax capacity will grow, and this conversation will get easier as time goes by.
In this corrective action plan, is there a deadline to get stuff done, and if not, there's penalties or something like that, or?
There's no hard deadline, and I think we've kind of made slow progress the last couple of years, and we're kind of at the point now where we have the landfill at a spot where we can put final cover up in there. We have enough volume in there to do that. So I think it's just gonna be kind of up to what the state decides, really. I mean, they could come and tell us we have to do it next year, or maybe we can slip by for a couple of years, but it's something that we should have as a priority and should get done.
Thank you. So, anything else on the capital plan update?
Well, Scott showed up, so I'm guessing he has a comment relative to the software and the radio upgrades that are proposed for public safety. And as I understand, Scott, you had budgeted for about half of that cost for the Phoenix software to be the county's share.
Do you want to come up, Scott?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't
Oh.
necessarily here for that.
Oh, you were here for something else, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're having a conversation, the software, you were planning on covering about half of that cost with dedicated funds from public safety, and the other half you had allocated on to capital funds for expenditures?
Correct, yep.
So roughly, I don't know if it was 60/40 or 50/50. And then we were talking about the radio upgrades was the other big item that was out there. And so those things I'm showing as not having a source of funds, although we do know that there are some dedicated funds here, so. And that, this conversation I think the most important thing to get from the board, and maybe maybe we'll just do a survey after this, is to identify projects that you'd like to see done or prioritized, and kind of give me a pie chart of what do you want to spend on economic development, current capital, and what do you want to save for future needs. I think would be a really good place to start. That will be our conversation relative to the policy of capital planning next week with general government, will be to try to identify what that pie chart looks like, so that we have guidelines and say, we're not gonna do this. I mean, are we gonna pull things from the ARPA list from a year ago and say, are we
So-
gonna?
Mr. Chair, was it Jeff or was it one of you that suggested a third?
I think I did initially.
That, okay.
And like I say, if we didn't have a grocery list already of stuff to
Yep.
do, it would be easy to say, well, let's do half here and go a year or two, see how that works out, and then adjust it after that. But when we've already got so much need, so much places the money can already go, and it's not gonna go away unless we find some kind of funding for it. And that's either that or increasing the levies or increasing the solid waste fees. It's all gonna add money.
So we'll have to make a decision relative to that, and I think the biggest thing, and I asked Scott if they had to carry the software for the first year, if they had funds sufficient for that, and he was gonna look and investigate to see if they did. But if they did, that would exhaust it, and the radios would be an unfunded need at this point in time, and we'd have to determine, can we do that in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, and have that conversation, make sure we don't have a discontinuity of operations. But really, those are, if we address the landfill costs and the radio costs, then we will have money available out of that allocation for economic development and to save for future use. That's my point, is between 400 and 800, we needed to make a determination on how we're gonna handle those things, or we're gonna spend it all next year, just on those, and we wouldn't have any left. So,
I just have a quick question on the public safety for the 50,000, for the jail planning, then looking down the road at the $7 million. So was the plan for that to bond for that? Without getting into the specifics of.
without getting into the specifics, part of my just straw poll of a third, is if we set $500,000 a year aside, and in 3 years down the road we did that, we wouldn't have to bond for 7 million, we could bond for 5.5, right?
But the idea is we would be bonding.
But the idea would be that there would be bonding, and at some point, there would be a commitment of those capital funds for debt service payment. So I would want you to see that over a period of time, so that $500,000, if we allocated to saving for future projects, at some point, would become debt service payments out of that. We'd have to also look at our other debt service schedule, and when those retire, hopefully allocate those to current county capital needs, right? So yes, that's a good question, and that would be it.
Because I believe that the current jail would not be paid off by the time.
No, I'd have to look at the debt service schedule, but
Yeah,
I
I don't
don't think it
remember
is.
what
I
it
think
is
it's
either.
32. might be 32 that matures. So this one would be paid out of that. And these are absolute placeholders
Yeah, I know.
from BKV,
Yeah.
but they give you an idea.
Yep.
And truthfully, if we were going to have any idea of having a project in '25, we would need to spend this 50,000 in '23 for planning to start development of engineering. And if we weren't planning on doing it in '25, we could, but we have to have conversations about those too, which is why I was glad to get this first draft out here, because it's at least a basis for a conversation, not a basis for decisions yet.
Thank you.
So just looking at the Phoenix software, the 250 dedicated, I think between cost sharing between the county and the cities involved, Akeley and Park Rapids, and then going to the restricted fund balances, I think we can bring that down to probably 65,000 versus 250 needed off of this for the software project.
So I'll work with Scott and revise those numbers and bring that to general government next Tuesday, and have that conversation. But yeah, the 257 was the county share after cost sharing, I believe. So
That was initial, correct.
Okay.
But after you and I talked about whether or not we can cover funds from.
Okay.
Cover that from some other funds.
We'll
we
get those specifics and update this list and bring it forward next Tuesday to that group.
Can we get a look at what it would look like if you did the third?
Yeah. Yeah, I can model this out 5 years if you want to do that. What would be fantastic, or I can grab it from Mary at HLDC, is try to populate some of the projects across there too, so we can see what it would look like. But it's really this economic development projects, this part needs to be filled in to demonstrate why we need to throw $500,000 or $550,000 a year up here and show how that's gonna have an impact.
Scott, while you're here, you wouldn't perceive an issue of spreading that radio cost over 3 years, would you?
No, I think we can make that work, for sure. Yeah.
And that's the $400,000.
Yeah. No, that's doable. If we can get a commitment to for the next 3 years, I think we
Yeah.
can do that.
So we could easily split that out there and show that way. Now those are, what, 6-7 year pieces of equipment?
The ones we're operating on now are about 11.
Yeah, right, but
They're-
that's longer than we should be planning for
Right,
that.
correct.
So somehow or another, we need to take those off of capital and get those into operating capital, so that we have funding for that, rather than having to come to this source for something, for $3,000 radios.
David's idea too was spreading that out over 3 years. That way then 10 years from now, you don't all of a sudden need to replace all the radios again.
Yeah.
We can
So
plan
we'll
better.
bring this next Tuesday. Thanks, Scott, didn't mean to put you on the spot like that.
No, it's okay.
And I don't see that we have, Jonathan yet, so I'm just gonna keep rolling with,
Budget updates?
Are you here for Jonathan?
Look, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Right.
I have some questions for you, so thank you for being here.
So I wanna look at this levy summary, and then we can walk through the materials that I emailed to you, and then the materials that were handed out this morning. But there's a couple of assumptions that I've talked about here. One is, these numbers, the 550 and the 460, are showing dedication of capital funds to take the capital spending out of the current budgets, so that we can minimize the levy that we need to carry the operating budget. Social services is proposed actual use of fund balance, and that's gonna be a challenge for them for next year, but that we had to bring their dollar increase down and phase that over a couple of years to get that to where it needs to be. This $908,000 is the shortfall that we have in the operating budget to meet the goal of the 9% operating increase. And my first way of doing that is to burn the $600,000 remaining of ARPA funds against that, and then have to spend $300,000 of other county fund balance to get that to happen. when we look at 2024 and 2025, the big chunk in that is from moving from 100% to 110% of the market relative to our compensation grid and staying pace with the labor market. That has a big update. I think that cost ended up being about $400,000 more than we thought it was gonna be. But that's because other people had already done it, right? As we were working through labor negotiations, we got to a point where we don't wanna be competitive today and then at the end of next year not be competitive again, because then we'd be looking at these corrective actions over and over again. So as we're reaching tentative agreements, and I'm hoping to be able to bring contracts to you to approve next Tuesday, at least a couple of them. I know that we're making good progress in finishing up the details on those. But that would be my goal, my suggestion would be to spend the ARPA here and then to throw that $300,000 against the general fund balance. And then taking a look at 24 and 25, we would probably have to capture any new tax capacity, which is usually 1.5% to 2.5% on just the improvement of housing stock in the county, and then add 3% to that. So I'm not talking about a big increase to carry the day and fill the gap of this this $300,000 operating hole for next year and for 25. It would probably be tax capacity increase, gain from new construction and new value, plus 3 to 3.5%, which would put us somewhere between 5 and 6.5% for an overall increase. The only possible option is, and I've come to understand that in the second year, the first full year of operation of Enbridge, there's gonna be an adjustment relative to the value of oil pumped through that pipeline. And I don't know what that number is. We won't get that number until July of next year.
I was gonna ask about if we were gonna get a bump there.
But if that would be another 2 or 3%, then I would still say that the best thing we could do would be to capture new tax capacity plus approximately 3% increase across the board. So I don't know what that number is. I don't have any way to estimate what that number is. I can't get anybody to give me a value on that. But I would think that from a planning standpoint, we'd be looking at 3% above tax capacity increase, new value tax capacity increase, not market increases. We will see market increases again next year, hopefully not like they were this year. But the sales study that we're gonna be looking back on when we do next year's equalization is gonna show high sales again. So that would be how I would propose resolving that and solving that. And that has a lot to do with being very deliberate about adding additional staff. I think in the summary you saw that there have been a lot of staff positions added in the last 6 or 7 years. And for good reasons, and all for improving the way that the county delivers services, for providing, IT services in-house, providing HR in-house, taking on recycling that we did from the DAC a few years ago. I mean, there were a lot of structural changes in how the county was operating. And then there's been a lot of changes in just the volume of work that we're doing. And that particularly shows in public safety and social services. So those are the 2 areas where we've had that.
So all of this talk that we've had so far hasn't taken into consideration anything for HLDC, correct? Because you think of the amount of dollars that we gave this last year, we don't have anything budgeted if we have to do something similar this year, correct?
From HLDC for,
Or not HLDC, I meant Heritage.
oh, no. No, I don't. I don't. I don't have anything held out for there. The only thing we would have to back that up was fund balance and the levy and our good faith. And yet, I hope and trust that the operating budget that's been presented to that board that shows a 1% operating cash flow for next year would
Yep.
say that we don't need to plan for that.
Well, I'm hoping so.
And I really hope that's true.
Yep.
But you're absolutely right. There's There's nothing else other than the county fund balance. Here's a snapshot of the September 30 fund balance. The general fund at 7.5, road and bridge at 9.5, social service at 4. And Josh is very quick to say that's a snapshot, that's a point in time, that's not all available. We need that for operating. So when I look at these numbers and the proposed operating budget and the percent of fund balance, you can see that overall, we're only at 58%. And we need to be at 42% to carry to cash flow for the first 5 months of the year, right? From the time that we get our fall levy to the time we get our spring levy, we need 42 to 50%. So we're not high. And then when I identify the proposed use in 2023, and then take a look at the ending, you can see that number comes down significantly.
Is that considering using the ARPA funds?
It is actually, because the ARPA funds are showing up in the $7.3 million. Because we claim those as revenue recapture, they're just sitting there as available fund balance. So yeah, we can't count that money twice.
And, this is an example of, and through, nobody could really control it. I totally understand that, COVID comes along and it's a wrecking ball that goes through things, but if that ARPA funding was available to us for other uses, again, how much easier would this be? But it's not, because it had to be dedicated to shore something else up, so.
But if it hadn't
just
been,
makes it-
if it hadn't been available, this picture would
We'd
look
be
bleak.
really,
You
and
know.
then local tax dollars would
Yep,
have been paid out to the tune of an extra three-some million dollars
yep.
to cover the heritage issues. So 100% grateful we have
Yep.
the ARPA funds, and to a large extent, that's what they were for.
Mhm.
But it would have been nice to use those, at least a portion of those funds, to set yourself up for better things, but unfortunately, that didn't happen.
Yeah, hopefully the Enbridge and the economic development can pick that ball up and move it forward, at least incrementally. But I wanted you to see this, and going into 2023, when we get our statements from the auditor's office, I'm gonna put just a one-page executive summary of things you want to pay attention to on this. And like Josh said, we need to do a 5-year look back on these fund balances to make sure that we identify them from one point in time to the next point in time. I think we're used to doing that with the social service reports. If you compare month to month back over 5 years, you can actually see the trend of whether the fund balance is growing or declining. This road and bridge one is really high, but remember, we're planning on doing $3 million of projects in excess of revenues this year, because we save up revenues in that account to be able to do big projects as they go forward. So this is not uncommon to plan to use that. And in the solid waste fee, if we come up with another source for that, if we raise, this is showing not raising the solid waste fee above the 188 that we were talking to in the initial numbers. So if we raise that and knock this down, we'll minimize that amount and leave some in there. But these are the kind of broad numbers that we have to have underlying all the decisions that we make relative to those other pieces. But everything else that I sent you in that PowerPoint and walk through was just kind of the supporting documentation. I'm still not seeing Jonathan, so I might just roll right into that.
I appreciate that PowerPoint too, because if you hadn't had a chance to look through it, it kind of broadly summarizes the whole thing and makes this discussion a little simpler to understand. Really well done, Jeff.
There, that's the button I'm looking for. So if we just, there's a bit of context on this that's really, I think, important. One of the counties gathered this information, certified levy per capita and the number of employees per 1,000 population served. And the really important thing to know is that we're in really good shape, and we're above average in performance and below average in cost to the public. with our current numbers, 22 numbers, right? Those are really important.
Okay, back
sorry.
up to that
Yep.
slide for just a minute. You know, we've talked about this before, but never really gotten data from it. How much do we do in Hubbard County that isn't mandated or required by statute?
I would guess that fully 80% of what we do is statutory requirements.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, yeah.
Without digging into it, there's just very little that we do that isn't.
Yep, okay.
And in that sense, when we're looking at comparing ourselves to other counties, that's really kind of the equalizer, because we're all doing that same 80%.
Yep.
And the other spending that we would do relative to economic development is kind of the optional stuff. The mental health or public health things that we do above the required minimums, those would be the things that are like that. And then, some of what we do relative to internal support for HR and administration and IT, we need to have, but the way that we do that is in excess of what's required, right? So I think that it would probably be less than 20% as optional at this point. And you can see the staffing history. I think it's really important to note that. When I look at actual numbers, I run an hours report, and I see how many hours we actually paid divided by 2080 and get a full-time equivalency. And then when I look at budgeted FTE, that's coming from the reports, and we have pretty good data going back to 19. When I go back to 18, it doesn't look quite the same. But HR had a list too of the positions that were added in 2016, 17, 18, up to number 7 that are proposed for next year. And you can see that the change in staffing is really coming from decisions made by the board based on the evidence they were presented with at that point in time. And as I mentioned, we added an HR staff. We've added to our capacity in social services, the county attorney's office, the sheriff's office. We took on recycling and solid waste. We added an IT department. We've added to capacity in those areas on several occasions, but this is the number of positions that we've added on an annual basis, about 8. And that's not gonna be sustainable. We're gonna have to find a way to slim that number down. And I'm not saying that the positions requested for 2023 aren't necessary. I can make an argument in favor of each one of them. I can show them in the context of the levy summary that we had and show you how we can pay for that. And yet that's the number we gotta watch.
That's why I asked the question.
Yep.
Are we hiring for things that we possibly wouldn't have to do, that we're doing as a service? Do we need to look at what we do as a service? That's not statutorily required.
Honestly, I think if you look at social services funding and you look at the mix of staff that we have now, our revenue recapture and our reimbursements are very good. And that means we have the right blend of staff and the right number for caseloads. When we look at that levy, the revenue forecast for social services has gone up by 5% and the expenditures have only gone up by 1%. So that's the change that we're looking for in making sure that our budgeting in social services is more accurate. But we're also accurately showing what we're doing well in that department. And the mix of staff that we have, social workers and caseworkers and everybody hitting their marks, has put us in a situation where that's being relatively successful. And the cost to the taxpayer is being minimized even though we've added staff to do it. You guys have heard that anecdotally over and over and over again, but we do get a significant amount of pass-through dollars that come through the state for the services we provide in that department. There's just a visual representation of what that number looks like. And here's kind of the nuts and bolts. You can see the wages in 2018 to 2021 and 2023, what they're gonna be. Payroll tax and para is a calculation. Health insurance is kind of an estimate. We're gonna be updating that now that we're through open enrollment and Gina and her staff are gonna update those numbers in IFS. And you can see we've had, well, when you see, when you see 2020 and we had a big increase, that was a negotiation year. Modest negotiation year. Modest. That's what we're seeing. I mean, that's kind of how we've leapfrogged through those negotiation years. And when I'm showing these levies over here, 16,050,000 was 22, 17,655 is the 9% on 650 and not showing the other 1.6 because that's not to be used for operating. And then I'm showing 5% and 5%. And you can see that we actually turned the corner on percent of our compensation that's funded by levy, from a low of 82% in '23 up to 84% in '25 with modest increases. So I think I think we can get there. And that's a 5% increase, and that's showing, like I said, actual capacity growth plus 3% gets us to a spot where I think we can get to the next negotiation session. Those are big numbers. They change significantly in a period of time, but they've changed significantly more so because of the number of staff we have than any individual costs. Then a really brief update, the implementation, the contract update. The implementation is to move from 36 classifications to 22. We reset the county from 100% of market to 110% of the market. A really important thing to note is if we would have stayed on our current scale, our deputies' starting and ending wage would be $4 an hour less than Beltrami. We would never be competitive with that. With our proposed wage increase, we're within pennies of Beltrami's county starting and ending, and we're above Wadena. So from a competitive standpoint, this adjustment of scale makes sense. It keeps us competitive. We raised the minimum county wage for Class 1, Step 1, and we adjusted the scale for several positions that were not in line with current market trends. We're transitioning to a new health plan in 2023. Open enrollment is complete and in the bag, not without significant effort on the part of Gina and her staff. We have tentative agreements with all 7 bargaining units, and I'm hoping, like I said, to have contracts on the agenda for Tuesday for you to be approving. Gina's going to be bringing the classification implementation to you, and we're hoping to start that effective the pay period November 20th. We were planning on doing it November 6th. If we would have gotten done 2 weeks earlier, we would have done that. Yep, just waiting for you, Jonathan.
That's what I figured. Sorry about that. I tried to tell the judge to hurry up.
So that's where we are relative to that. The handout you have has additional detail. I would say that we would move on with the next item and come back to budget if we have additional questions. Mr. Chair, that's your call.
I think we'll move on to the number 1 on the agenda. If we're done with the budget discussion.
We are at a point, we can stop, or we can continue it later, or I think I've covered all the major pieces that I wanted to make sure you heard today.
Okay. Any of the board want to have more budget discussion before we?
We have several people here for this discussion. I think we should move on.
Yeah. So we'll do hello, Jonathan. Proposed ordinance for the regulation of the sale of indigestible products containing THC and drug paraphernalia in Hubbard County. Ordinance number 45. You've got the floor.
Thank you. And as noted, well, as the board is aware, this is a work session. This has been brought before the board a couple of different times for some direction from the board as to how to move forward. If the board would like to move forward either with no action, some sort of regulation action, or to ban the sale of THC products outright in the county. The ordinance that has been sent and is in front of the board today for consideration at another meeting is a licensing ordinance that is one of the three options. And before we get too far into what this ordinance said, or says, and would do if the board were to vote on it, I would ask that is there a consensus that this is the direction the board would like to go? Or would the board like a second ordinance to consider as well, which would be to not allow it to be sold in the county at all? And so I defer to the board on that question.
And I would throw procedurally, your conversation today is generally about consensus to make sure that Jonathan understands which of the three ways that you want to go at some point in time. But administratively, from the standpoint of enacting an ordinance, we have a responsibility for setting, at some point at a regular meeting, not in a work session, we would have to set the date for a public hearing, we would have to post the notice, we would have to hold the public hearing. This is not intended to be a public hearing, this is intended to be just a consensus idea. Make sure that Jonathan knows what the board's wish is, get that to you so you can set the date and move forward if your intent is to take action relative to an ordinance. A big, long conversation about which of those the ways you want to go, have whatever conversation you need to today to get him that information. But the actual opportunity for the public to comment would be at the posted and noted public hearing.
Agreed, and really it's a consensus that I'm asking for, and we've done this a couple of different times now to see it. And this is a tough issue for a couple of different reasons, which is why I'm deferring to the board. This is a legislative decision, ultimately up to the 5 electeds on the commission. Not to be disrespectful to the board in any way, I do have other things to do, and I've drafted a number of different ordinances, so I don't really want to draft another ordinance unless that's something that the board wants me to do, the consensus of the board. So that's my question, is should I draft anything else, or is this something that has been drafted and provided to the board? Is this what the board would like to consider? Or something different?
I think the licensing is important. I think this, what you've given us today, I believe needs to have some tweaking done to it. But overall, I think you've got on one end doing nothing, which I don't think is viable, and then the other end of not allowing it at all, which we've already got several businesses, even one that actually manufactures and everything here in Hubbard County, so we would be shutting down existing businesses too. So I think we've got it, this would be, in my opinion, a happy medium, a beginning, because we never know too what the legislature is going to do next year.
Mr. Chair, we have several different representation here of that work within the county with different age groups. Would you mind if we asked?
I would say no, because we don't have the opposing viewpoints. We would be getting one side of the argument. That's my opinion. I thought we were today going to be discussing the draft.
But Jonathan asked what the consensus of the board was, so I'd be interested to hear what law enforcement thinks about licensing versus a different option.
I think it's a little different than the public perspective, because these are county entities. You know that HIP is part of county, Sheriff's Department's obviously part of the county, county attorney's obviously part of county. They're here to advise us. So it's a little different than just public comment, in my opinion. But two questions I would have that, if they provide some feedback for, that are concerns of mine, is being that the state legislature has approved this, I'm worried about how we consistently apply things that are legal in the state of Minnesota. So how would you treat this differently than alcohol or tobacco, or should you be? And then the second question, if we did go down the road of an outright ban, how would that be enforced? Would that be more expensive to enforce than licensing? My guess is probably, because my understanding is most counties are doing nothing. And so you may have a lot of people come into this county that aren't aware of it being banned, which will create quite a mess from an enforcement standpoint potentially. So that might be the worst way to go, in my opinion, but I would be interested in how people feel about that.
And to advise the board on that as the county attorney, and obviously if Chief Deputy Parks wants to join in on this, that's fine too. That is a valid question on enforcement and what the cost would be for a ban versus licensing. Any time that there is a new ordinance for enforcement, there's gonna be a cost. Whether it be a requirement to get licensed and specific requirements as to how you can sell, who you can sell to, who can sell it, where it can be sold, you're gonna have some enforcement costs that go along with that. The outright ban, in my opinion, would be more, well, it would cost more. And there are some reasons why you would have issues with, or we would have enforcement issues to overcome, as far as how do we determine what exactly is being sold, what that level is that makes it otherwise legal but falls under our ordinance, and how do we test that and make all that happen. There is gonna be some costs associated with that if the board decides to go that route. But there's gonna be a cost either way, is my advice.
Licensing seems a little easier to me because there's an obvious trigger, you know, based on what's in the ordinance, and that's obviously then followed up with an investigation, and then it's pretty clear what kind of action would be taken after that, where a full-on ban, who knows where that's gonna lead you.
Right. There's a lot of unknowns.
Yep.
Agreed, as far as the cost to enforce.
And there was a,
That's where
there was
I
a-
was,
there was a question raised earlier about how much of county spending is mandated and how much isn't. All of this isn't at this point in time, because the state statute doesn't give any direction. As a general rule, just remember that the states have to uphold federal statutes, counties have to uphold state statutes. County can enact local ordinances or policy above that, but we can always be a little more prescriptive, but we always have to uphold at least the federal and the state statutes.
okay. Mr. Chair, ma'am, make a comment? Okay. One of the thoughts that I've had was that, you know, just all of a sudden, do we want to go with this proposed ordinance or a ban? I don't know if I was ready to make that kind of straw poll right now. I'd like to hear more from the public, what the community thinks about which way we should go with this.
Now, I believe the other side spoke at the last meeting, or at least individuals who strongly
We
disagree with
We heard
this.
one side, yeah.
Yeah,
I'd like to hear more.
and so you have a differing viewpoint here today. And being a representative of the Board of HIP, I do want to make sure that the board is aware that the primary consideration I have, and this carries through with being a county attorney as well, is the protection of the youth in this community. And that's what it comes down to, is if this is gonna be sold, if we're selling an intoxicating item here in the county, first of all, is that something that we as a community are okay with? That the juvenile youth is going to have access to that, and that's a decision for the county board. But secondly, if so, how do we do the best we can to make sure that that's not getting into the hands of the youth, and it's not being utilized? And that we have enforcement mechanisms to make sure that the juvenile youth know that it is illegal for them to possess. And right now, it is not. And that is problematic, in my opinion, for the youth of our community. And I just want to make sure that the board's aware of that.
Mr. Chair, I would also add that there's a cost to doing nothing too. It's pretty hard to completely quantify, but it's there. You know, and how's that compared to the other two options?
You know, at the AMC regional meeting we had in Bemidji a couple weeks ago, Dan actually was there with me and asked the question. And I guess Tom was there too. it didn't sound like any county that was present was doing anything. I know Cass County came right out and said, we don't plan to do anything. And like I say, the other counties that were representative, I don't remember anybody bringing forward anything.
I think there's, like David said, a cost to not doing anything.
Yeah.
My choices would be either the ordinance or a ban, one or the other. But I'm not sure which way to go with them yet. I'd like to hear more.
So, Mr. Chair, I'd like to remind the board that if you do any reading on the marijuana, when we think of the 70s and marijuana wasn't such a big deal, the current level for THC is 25% higher. I share Jonathan and HIP's concern, and I respectfully ask that we could hear from law enforcement. I really would like to know
But we're
how
not,
they feel about this.
but we're not talking marijuana. We're talking THC
I know we are.
edibles.
But that still involves marijuana.
I think if the board would like, Scott, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know he's here because Corey wasn't able to be here today. I'm speaking as the county attorney as far as advising the board as to what the options are. Perhaps law enforcement has something to say on the issue as far as enforcement.
I'd like to hear from them too, because, you know, there, at some point in time, if we decide to go down this route, there will be a public hearing and everybody will have a chance to speak again.
From the enforcement standpoint, I agree with what's been already stated here, that we need to do something. We can't, I don't think.
Do you want to come up here? So,
I don't think we can, do nothing. I think we need a basis to start from the enforcement standpoint. We have had some discussions about the potential cost of, or how do we even enforce or prosecute a ban? And it's gonna be tough. We do need to have something in place that restricts the juveniles or the youth from possessing this stuff. So I agree with Jonathan on that, because that needs to be I think our foremost concern here is the youth and the juveniles. So it would take some sort of an ordinance to put that into effect, where the juveniles can't possess here in Hubbard County. As far as enforcing an all-out ban, in some cases that could be easier than enforcing a licensing violation, because if you just say it's not legal here at all, then we just have to prove that there's the presence of THC in this product that this person.
Can I ask a clarification, because you guys are not being clear with ban? Are you talking about a ban on the sales or the ban on the possession of THC as legally described in Minnesota?
No, and that's a fair distinction, and my understanding of, I think both is really, and they are different, correct? The sale and the possession, and to speak to the possession issue, possessing an otherwise legal intoxicating substance in the state of Minnesota, obviously that's a question the board has to ask themselves as to how they want to vote on that issue. I would say that I do not expect the state to make it any type of even a civil or regulatory action against juveniles. They've decriminalized tobacco, for instance, as it relates to juvenile possession. I think in this case, I would advise for restricting possession for at least juveniles, because it does give us some additional enforcement mechanisms when we're talking about our youth. And our youth know in the community that it is not legal for them to even possess. And that is a deterrent factor in its own right. And in my opinion, that's an important factor for the board to consider.
So from an enforcement standpoint on a ban, then you just have to prove that there's the presence, any presence, and then that's illegal under our ordinance, or not allowed under our ordinance. If you go down the licensing and regulatory path, then we're into quantitative testing. We have to go in and we have to say, okay, so you're selling this product, are you above the 0.3%, which is allowed by state statute? That's where we may run into some issues finding an accredited lab that can give us a quantitative test. And then if we do have some sort of trial or evidentiary hearing, then how do we get these expert witnesses in here to testify to these lab results. So, like Jonathan already said, a lot of unknowns, an outright ban. On the front end is probably easier to enforce, but creates some more issues on the back end, specifically cost. The licensing and regulation ordinance creates a whole separate set of issues, so.
So Scott, I have a question on that, because a couple years, pre-COVID, whatever year it was, we had heard from a commissioner from the state of Washington and a county commissioner from the state of Colorado about this. And so one of the problems they were having is, you know, you send stuff to the lab, and it's tied up for months. So let's say a business in town, you know, you suspect, and so you're tested. So then do you allow them to remain just selling as is until it hits the courts? Or what's the procedure for that?
It's gonna be determined on a case-by-case basis. I mean, the circumstances at the time. It's hard to put a general, blanket policy on that question, because every case will be different. I would say generally, if you're in a gray area where we're not sure if what they're selling is illegal, say they're advertising it or packaging it as legal, but we suspect it's illegal, I think we would have a tough time seizing that stuff off the shelves if it's packaged as legal, until we got a test back indicating that no, their packaging was in fact wrong or illegal, the substance is illegal.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but yeah, that's a great question. And really, if you think about it, right now, there are different businesses that are selling otherwise, at least we believe, otherwise legal THC products in the state. But how do we know that it's not more than the 3%? Because they're not regulated. Nobody's checking to make sure that it's not 6% or 9%.
That was gonna be my question.
Yeah.
Is the producers required to have somebody testing it to verify these are the levels?
That's a great question for the Department of Health from the state, as they should have already dealt with this, in my opinion. That being said, that's the point that Scott is making, is that's something that we as a county have to look at as well. And if this is gonna be regulated, how are we going to enforce that? How are we gonna figure out whether it's legal, whether they're meeting the threshold of below 3%, the 5 milligrams, you know, less than 50 per packaging? Who's gonna be testing that? What labs we're gonna use? Those are all important things that we could put into the ordinance right now. To answer your question that you first brought up, the ordinance that's in front of the board for the work session, at least today, that's been drafted, would allow the board to not renew a license where there was a violation, whether it be in any way, whether they sold to someone under the age or they're selling something that's otherwise illegal. The board at that renewal annual license would simply not renew. That would be the enforcement mechanism as far as how do you shut it down.
And that would be one of my questions with the ordinance, if we were gonna have an appeals process. So there again, now, the companies that are selling these products are assuming that they're legal products. And then if, for some reason, there's a compliance check, they found that they're not in compliance, but this store owner had no idea, is there gonna be a process where they're gonna be able to state their case? Or are we just gonna decide, nope, you're done?
That's a county board decision as to how you want to go about that. I do put a lot of emphasis on the fact that if you have a business, you need to know what you're selling, especially when it's an intoxicating substance. So I would leave it at that.
Unfortunately, you would think at some point in time the state would have some guidelines on packaging like they do for alcohol and tobacco, so you know what the content is.
Right.
But they hastily passed a bill, and it's now legal. And that's where I kind of come down on the side that to try and be consistent here with how we apply licensing and regulation to tobacco and alcohol, but also provide that layer of protection to keep it out of the hands of our youth, is better than doing nothing.
Agreed.
And I'll go back to alcohol, which I've stated before is the most used and abused drug in the world. So somebody's selling supposedly 3-2 beer, and it ends up it's stronger than that. Do they lose when they come to renew their license and they don't get their license?
They could, yes.
Under our current ordinance, they get 5 chances before their license is taken.
And I would just point out, that's much more regulated, but when you're talking about setting up labs and testing and doing that, you don't do that with alcohol because you trust the labels. Right. So that's, I think, the big miss and disconnect from the state as far as the regulation of what's available for sale and how that's the big disconnect. Because testing licensing to make sure that nobody's selling to minors is not that onerous. As having a licensing system for these products in addition to alcohol and tobacco is not that onerous. Taking on the need to have to test the volume of that, I don't even know that we would have the capacity to do that. There's resources to be able to do that. But that's the big miss on the state's part, is because the products are not regulated.
The state really does need to take that on. And the state does it through the BCA lab as it relates to methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin. They're 9 months behind at the moment, and very backed up as it relates to their testing. Which is why maybe one of the reasons why they haven't gotten on board with actually looking at how to solve this issue that Jeff just brought up. And it's a very important issue to be solved. Agreed.
Yeah, because as far as obviously selling to kids or even them having the possession, I don't care if it's cigarettes, alcohol, THC, whatever else is out there, even over-the-counter drugs and stuff like that, they can overdose on.
Right.
So, I mean, that's important that we set up these protections. I'm just worried about, we have what is now a legal product in Minnesota, and we're telling people who are 21 and older, don't worry, we've got you covered. We're not going to let you buy this in Hubbard County because we know best.
Good point.
I guess I would ask for board consensus as to, would the board like the option at a public meeting of a ban of both possession and sale, a ban of just the sale, as well as no youth possessing as well, which is kind of what I'm getting from the board and why I'm asking the question? Or would the board like to go forward with a public meeting on the licensing ordinance that's been put in front of the board here today alone? That is what, like I said.
And I'll offer another
Yeah, there's
administrative option.
multiple other options as well.
If you don't have enough information to make that determination, you can set a public hearing to just hash that out and listen to people.
That's the way I'd like to go.
You cannot set a public hearing to consider an ordinance until you know specifically what ordinance that is, and you publish a summary of that in order to say, we're gonna consider this ordinance.
That's a great point.
So if you need more information, you just need to set a public hearing to have a public town hall meeting about this conversation and listen to people.
We do that?
We can, and we would base it off of what's in front of the board right now, which is this licensing ordinance.
But if
And then the board can vote no on that and ask for an additional.
In order to bring an ordinance forward, you would have to be bringing an ordinance forward, and if you set the public hearing, this is the ordinance we're proposing, people show up, they have conversation about that. If you make technical changes, if you make administrative changes, you can still move forward, right, with approving that ordinance. If you change it structurally and you look at regulation versus sale versus licensing, you change one of those major terms, you'd have to have another public hearing. So before you get to the point of determining which ordinance you want to potentially bring forward, you need to be relatively clear about which of the 3 lanes you want to go down. If you have that ability to make that choice now, we can move forward. If you don't feel you have that ability, then you need some other public input or some other process to be able to get you there.
So Jonathan, are you saying the ordinance as you have drafted it right now does not ban possession?
It does for juveniles, but not for adults.
So at this point in time, I'd be supportive of the proposal in front on licensure, because I do think that provides a layer of protection to keep it out of the hands of youth too. Without creating the problem, like Ted said, where we're telling adults what to do because we know better. I'm not so sure about that.
And I'm supportive of this ordinance. Like I say, there was just a couple of things, and I don't know if we want to go into the details or not. I wanted to get to the one, though, that was kind of alarming to me, if that's the word I want to use. Seven D, under number, subsection 2, 7D. And this is where I'm wondering if this is even constitutional. Any designated inspection officer or law enforcement officer of the county shall have the right to enter, inspect, and search the premises of a licensee during business hours without a search warrant.
That has been upheld. Constitutional, yes.
Okay, because I don't see that in any of our other ordinances.
Many counties and cities throughout the state have that in there, and it's mostly for compliance checks to make sure that the retail establishment is not selling to minors. But in this context, I think it's even more important based off of the need for law enforcement to make sure, given it's not regulated what they're actually selling or buying, getting from the dispensary, for law enforcement to be able to come in and inspect and make sure that it's below that legal threshold. That's the difference in this case from alcohol for us, in my opinion, for alcohol and tobacco. And that's the reason that I put it in there. That is something the board could disagree with, of course, and I leave that to the board. But given the fact that it's not, we don't know exactly what it is until it's tested, that's why that's in there.
Okay.
You have to read it under the subcontext of conditions of license.
True.
When
as
they're
well.
applying for a license, they are granting authority of the agency who's regulating it, the ability to regulate.
But and my question is, search the premises, but what are they searching for? And in a sense, what are considered the premises? Say that
Sure.
a person manufactures some of their products at home. I know one of our businesses does that. So now all of a sudden, we're asking this person, yeah, you can have a license as long as you give up your right.
And we do that in a number of different ways throughout. The government does that on a very regular basis, where there's a license granted or a permit granted or a conditional use permit granted, where we, as the government, say, we'll give you this, but you have to give this up. It happens all the time. And I would note that there is due process as it relates to law enforcement, for instance, or some other government entity going into a business and searching it without a search warrant. The due process right is a challenge to whatever is found if they are ultimately going to lose a license or if they're getting criminally charged with a crime. That due process is going to go through the court system, and they're going to have the ability to have their day in court or their day in front of the board to make it for the elected judge or board to make a determination as to whether or not the government's actions in going in were justified at that time. So this, and that's true with CUPs, that's true with permits. So I definitely understand the commissioners, chairpersons, I should say, I apologize, comments on that, but I really do want to emphasize that there are a number of protections for our citizens already in place to make sure that their rights are not just thrown out the window.
And going through several of the county ordinances, just a note, the tobacco ordinance needs to be updated.
Sure.
Well, Mr. Chair, if you've been looking for a consensus, prefer adding, that one small minor step in there to see what the public thinks about banning first.
Yeah.
And then going from there, especially since the state needs to do more work with regulation themselves, just on the product. So that's where I'm at.
Commissioner Christensen.
I would support what Tom is saying. I'm thinking about so many things that we have made legal in the premise of we are adults and we can decide for ourselves. And all those things come with a cost that we don't always see. And so this is just another thing that we're trying to satisfy ourselves as having a good time. So I will be interested to see what the public
Yeah,
has to say.
Just one extra meeting, that's all.
and I am too, because, I don't want to get a flood of calls and emails and stuff like that, but I haven't had anybody say to me that this is a good ordinance. We should be doing this. I've actually got quite the opposite. I get testimonials about how I haven't been able to sleep, for years. Now I've tried this product and I sleep great, and I know of a mother who had a child that has epilepsy or whatever it is, has seizures, and has found relief through this kind of a product. So I'm hearing one side and not so much of the other. I don't know if the board wants to hear a couple minutes from some of the people that made the effort to show up today.
I would.
I'm wondering if Ms. Graham would like to speak first. I guess I can keep sitting here.
Good morning.
Morning.
I did come and ready to share, if the board was willing to hear me talk this morning. So, to the chair and to the board, again, my name is Angela Graham. I work for CHI St. Joseph's Health here in Park Rapids, Minnesota, as a Drug-Free Communities Grant and Hubbard and Prevention Coalition Coordinator. Hubbard and Prevention Coalition is currently funded by a Drug-Free Communities Grant to help reduce underage alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco use among youth in Hubbard County. I am here to advocate on behalf of the local youth and their families in Hubbard County. Research tells us that an important predictor of substance abuse is how risky that behavior is perceived to be by the user. Those perceiving higher levels of risk are less likely to use than those perceiving lower levels of risk are more likely to use. The presence of commercial cannabis establishments and are frequently by youth in Hubbard County would demystify cannabis for youth and reinforce the untrue idea that it is not harmful. Considering the following, edibles are food products infused with marijuana. Though smoking marijuana is the most prevalent method of consumption, eating marijuana is quickly becoming a popular way to consume the drug. Is eating marijuana more dangerous than smoking marijuana? Yes, there's a high potential for overdose of marijuana edibles. The effects of smoking marijuana only takes minutes. Edibles, however, take 1 to 3 hours because food is absorbed into the bloodstream through the liver because it takes longer. The user may end up consuming longer amounts of the drug or end up consuming larger amounts of the drug while thinking the drug isn't working. Marijuana is commonly used by adolescents, second only to alcohol. Since 2017, high school students' perception of harm from regular marijuana use has been steadily declining over the last decade. A number of states have legalized adult marijuana for medical or recreational purpose while it remains illegal under federal law. The legalization movement may be impacting youth perception of harm from marijuana. The human brain continues to develop from before birth into the mid-20s and is vulnerable to the effects of addictive substances. Frequent marijuana use during adolescence is associated with changes in the area of the brain involving attention, memory, decision-making, and motivation. impaired learning in adolescence. Chronic use is linked to decline in IQ, school performance that jeopardizes professional and social achievement and life satisfaction. Increased rates of school absence and dropout, as well as suicidal attempts. Contrary to popular belief, marijuana is addictive, and research shows that 1 in 6 people who start using the drug before the age of 18 can become addicted, and 1 in 10 adults who use the drug can become addicted. Over the past few decades, the amount of THC in marijuana has steadily climbed. Today's marijuana has at least 3 times the concentration of THC compared to 25 years ago. Let me share with you some of the Hubbard County and District Minnesota Student Survey data regarding youth use. This is just preliminary. The data from the students is just coming in from when they took it in 2022. But what we have so far is in past month marijuana use, the rate of marijuana use among Hubbard County 8th, 9th, and 11th grade increased from 9% in 2013 to 16% in 2016, then dropped back down to 9% in 2019. During that time frame, the state average was around 9 to 10%, so we're kind of equal to the rest of the Minnesota. But in 2022, marijuana was reported by 5% of Park Rapids' 8th and 9th graders. It was reported by 16% of 11th grade males and 9% of 11th grade females. Marijuana use was reported by 10% of Nevis 8th graders and 6% of Nevis 9th graders. Data for the 11th graders is not available. And there were no LaPorte 8th graders reporting marijuana use, and the data is not available yet for 9th and 11th graders. I do have information, if you wish to hear, in regarding to Minnesota Student Survey data on the past year use of meth, cocaine, and opioids by our youth. I have that information if you are interested. Just a couple of last comments that I have is Hubbard County has the opportunity to be proactive and make decisions that improve compliance among cannabis retailers with laws prohibiting the sale or marketing of cannabis products to underage persons. It also mitigates the risk and reduce exposure of young people to the product and to the marketing of the products. A local regulatory system for cannabis retailers is appropriate to ensure that retailers comply with the cannabis law to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our youth and adults in Hubbard County. Research has demonstrated that local tobacco retailer ordinance dramatically reduce youth access to cigarettes and therefore provide a useful model for preventing sale to youth of cannabis products. As policymakers, you've been given authority to enact regulations governing time, place, and manner of adult use cannabis. Again, if you do not believe that cannabis is harmful, if youth do not believe that cannabis is harmful, they are more likely to use it. So logically, if we restrict the presence of cannabis retail establishments in areas where they frequent, we will protect their futures by reducing their likelihood to exposure, use, and possible resulting in addiction. At the minimum, Hubbard and Prevention Coalition supports a licensing ordinance or to the ban of the sale of cannabinoid intoxicating substances. Hubbard and Prevention Coalition is also a resource to advocate, help educate, build skills, and provide public service messaging, campaigns, and other resources to the community about the risks and consequences of youth cannabis use, purchasing cannabis for minors, and driving under the influence of cannabis. I encourage you to step up for our youth and protect them as much as you can. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Showing my age, having to take off my glasses to read.
Okay. Any comments? Next.
I just have one question. Have you done any studies about whether that usage then leads to something else for drug usage?
Can you say that again?
So have you done any studies with the youth in this area to see if they started with marijuana, if that led them to use something else in the drug field?
I have not. And I have done some research into it as far as from other research organizations, but there's not a whole lot out there as far as like saying that marijuana is a gateway drug to anything else. But it is part of marijuana is a co-occurring substance where the youth use marijuana plus they use alcohol or tobacco or opioids, like they use them in together.
I defer to the chairman.
Sure, next.
Good morning. I'm Mike Lemire. I'm the principal at Century School, so I'm charged with overseeing 1,200 of our 4-year-olds through 14-year-olds, and so this is a very important issue to me. I think a lot of what Angie shared on the data and the information is really important, and I wanted to share the school district's perspective on enforcement in the schools and how this impacts our students within the school setting. And so when we talk about an outright ban, I agree with Mr. DeLaunt that making decisions for adults is not my purview. I'm really focused on how do we restrict access to our children and make sure that we have support in helping that. So far this year, we've taken edibles from students on 2 occasions, and they were 11-year-olds, so we're talking about very young children, and they look like candy. There is no way for someone to determine what is candy, what is a THC edible, and it can be used in plain view. They can hand them out at lockers, they can hand them out to friends, and other children don't know that it's an intoxicating substance, and that's concerning to me. Comparatively to vaping or using a THC vape, it's a very intentional act. They have to find somewhere privately or hidden to try to do that without getting caught, whereas these edibles make it very dangerous. One of the problems that we found when we worked with students on the edibles is that it is because it's not illegal for students to possess or anyone to possess, we've had no enforcement mechanism outside of school. So while we've had school policy that helps us enforce the intoxicating substances, and we can do school discipline, the students have had no outside consequences. And I'm not looking to criminalize our children, but I would really like to be able to partner with our legal team to get parents involved in the process and have parents have some accountability, because what we found is the parents have had it legally, and that's fine for adults in my opinion, but our children are then having access to it, and there's no mechanism for those families to either get additional supports or have some sort of court-ordered supports to keep their kids from using it. And I think our children know that. So while they don't have it at school as often, they are still able to access it in the community. And I do worry about them bringing it into our schools when it looks like candy and knowingly or unknowingly distributing it to other children. And like I said, I have 4-year-olds in my building and I have 14-year-olds in my building. And 4- and 5-year-olds put everything in their mouth. And so if it looks like candy, they're gonna think it's candy, and that concerns me greatly. So I think when looking at the possible options, I don't believe the do nothing option would help us as the school, because it doesn't, we can still enforce school policy, but we don't have that legal branch to help us enforce things within the home setting and hold students accountable in that way. So I do appreciate that the ordinance does account for the possession of students having it, making that illegal, or our children having it, so that we do have some opportunities to partner with our law enforcement agencies, so.
And Jonathan, we have a social host ordinance?
We do,
Okay, and is there something,
in this
that's
ordinance.
one of the ordinance I didn't read.
It is. It's a gross misdemeanor as well to sell to or provide to someone under the age of 21 in this ordinance.
Okay.
That is not on any other, that's not the law right now. Procuring or giving to an underage individual is not currently illegal.
Okay, so if we pass.
It is to sell, but not to buy it and then give it to them.
Okay, so would be my question then is, with this ordinance, would that cover it, or should we adjust the social host ordinance to also cover it?
We, that's a good point as to amending or at least updating the social host ordinance is probably a better way to say it. It is included in this licensing, and I would note that it's included in the alcohol license as well, the licensing that, that it's illegal to give to someone else, barter, sell, give. And that's included here, but I do agree with you, it would make sense to update the social host ordinance as well, and cover it in that way as well.
And sorry to interrupt, Mike, did you have anything else?
No, thank you. I just appreciate the time to talk to you.
You're welcome, thank you.
Just to reinforce Principal Revere's comment about how.
You want to come up here so the public can hear you if they're on, listening
Just to
in?
reinforce Principal Lemire's point about not being able to tell the difference between candy and some of these edibles. We did pull some, I had my task force agent pull some open source photos, just comparing some packaging. So I can certainly hand these out to the board if you care to look at some of these photos, and just give you an idea of what's out there and what we are dealing with from trying
Thank
to
you.
protect our youth.
Because I thought that's one of the things the state legislature did was made it,
I got to double.
tried to make it not appealing to children. I don't remember how it's worded. Yeah. Like this one.
I agree, it can't be marketed to children,
Yeah, I mean, that's.
per state statute.
Yeah, that seems illegal.
It is illegal, in my opinion, but I'm not a judge.
Sure. And Scott, real quick, are these here in Hubbard County?
No, these not necessarily, these are just open source photos from
Oh.
internet photos.
Okay, because this is concerning.
We have seen there's similar products in Hubbard County.
Okay.
Without getting into details on specific cases, we have seen products that are almost identical to this in Hubbard County.
Thank you. Yes,
My name's Kathy Nevins. I'm a nurse practitioner at Essentia Health, and my practice is 99% substance use disorders. I treat people for substance use disorders, mostly the ones that will kill them, which would be heroin and fentanyl and methamphetamine. So I loved your question that you had to Angie about the, what does it lead to? What does cannabis lead to? And currently, today, I've been doing this for about 5.5 years now. I've seen 240 patients come to me with opioid use disorder or some type of substance use disorder. And one of the things I do is I go through their full background of what led them to that point. There are currently 8 of those 240 that did not report to me a history as a teenager of what I call the big 3, cannabis, tobacco, and alcohol, and how many times have those things come up today, right? And so I think there are some studies we can find that will show that cannabis is a gateway drug. And from my anecdotal practice, I absolutely agree. It is a gateway drug. Now, the question is it, that's retrospective. That's saying people who end up developing substance use disorders started with cannabis early on. That doesn't mean that everybody who uses cannabis as a teenager is going to develop a substance use disorder. There's a clear distinction there. I think everything that I've heard this morning makes it 100% clear to me that Hubbard County does not want cannabis in the hands of our youth. That's 100% I would agree with that. So then the real question that you guys are tasked with the sloppy way that the state did this, is to say, do we ban it or do we develop ordinances to control it? And I'm really glad that you're not considering doing nothing, because that's not the right answer, although I do believe the state will clean that up. Personally, I would say ban it. And the only reason that I say that is drugs kill people. and every drug has side effects, whether they're prescribed or whether they're not. The state has a very good system for medical cannabis, and I am one of the people who will support medical cannabis. And the reason that I do, so I'm not talking out of both sides of my mouth here, is that you have to have a medical certifying diagnosis. The person who mentioned to you that their family member had epilepsy. Epilepsy is a certifying diagnosis for medical cannabis. That's not what we need to discuss, right? There is this list.
I think there was the cost.
Oh, the cost is much higher for medical cannabis. However, when you buy cannabis on the street, you're playing Russian roulette. And I will tell you from the urine drug screens of my patients, they buy cannabis on the street, it's got methamphetamine in it, it's got fentanyl in it. People who are buying CBD or THC containing products and are doing urine drug screens in my office for my work with them, and they don't think that they're getting THC, and it shows up positive, and all of a sudden they're really upset because their PO is gonna have a problem with that, and the levels that are in this, I mean, you guys are spot on, that is 100% dysregulated and not controlled, and I think that the state will get better with it, but they're not there. But I applaud you not saying we're gonna do nothing until the state gets it figured out, because we will have a bigger problem with our youth. And we don't need to keep people in business who are doing things that are going to hurt the people who live in our county. We have a responsibility for that as well.
Just had to ask one comment. You brought up the fact that some of this stuff has got other ingredients in it. I would implore people who have teenagers or young adults to have that conversation with them, that anything you get off the street could easily be laced with fentanyl now. And
it's horrible.
you may be making a life or death decision and don't even know it. That's
Absolutely.
how bad it's getting.
Most of our new patients coming in, that's what's driving them to the fact that they're finally gonna deal with this problem that they have, is because they can't take the risk, and it's a risk, and why do we want people from other counties to come to us to get it here because they can? We don't want that. So I would support a ban, but if we aren't gonna get a ban, then definitely an ordinance to restrict it and keep it away from our youth. And on our housing discussion earlier, we've got all that opioid settlement money coming in, and we can use that for housing.
I don't know if it's a large sum for
It
Hubbard
isn't a
County.
large sum. It sounds like a large sum, but it's not.
It's something though.
Yeah, I'm on the opioid epidemic response advisory council for the state, and we're gonna have 26 million next year. And cities and counties, which thank you for signing on for that, you know, they have 75% from what, so they've got 80 million. And yeah, Hennepin gets a lot compared to Hubbard, but it's gonna add up over 18 years, and housing is on the list, so.
Thank you.
You bet. Sorry, I went a little.
It's okay. Who'd like to be next?
Just from public health, I just wanted to make one statement to.
Marley, could you come up, because if people are listening in, they can't hear you.
And this is just really detail. So, someone earlier said the Department of Health, but this is actually regulated by the Board of Pharmacy. The cannabis falls under,
misspoke.
and there's
I
a frequently
apologize.
asked question, if any of you want to see about their regulation and their requirements, I can share. That's all I really had to say, because public health hasn't really, the Department of Health doesn't have any regulatory control over the sale of cannabis. Okay?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, Jonathan again here. I take it from the board that the consensus right now is to set a public hearing without a proposed ordinance, to hear from the public, which we, I believe, can do, but I defer to Jeff as to whether that needs to be at a work session, or, I'm sorry, not a work session.
I'm not sure that was the consensus of
Okay.
the board. I would like to have an ordinance before we would, so if you're proposing that we just have a hearing and nothing on the table, I would propose that we would have something on the table, and it appears that the consensus would be this one. Because we can always change it if we decide.
If you,
But you can't change it to a ban.
if you post a notice for the public hearing to consideration of this ordinance as it's drafted, okay, you can have that public hearing. If the consensus is that you would move forward to take a vote on that, you could do that. If your consensus was to change track and go someplace else, you would go someplace else.
We just have another
But if you
public
have,
hearing.
if you alter the proposed ordinance significantly, you would have to have another public hearing. So that a course for cleanest possible action would be to schedule a public hearing at the meeting on Tuesday to consider the adoption of this ordinance, hold that public hearing, hear that public comment, decide what you're gonna do with it based on that. And if you go forward to take action, you can take action after the public hearing. If you decide you want to change course and have elements modified, you'd have to schedule another. It'd be just like the shoreland ordinance and the short-term rental deal that we went through last year, or 2 years ago, that had a couple of different iterations. As long as the ordinance you propose at the public hearing stays pretty similar, then you can consider it and move forward with it. If you change it structurally from licensing to restriction, then it'd be different, but.
So, Tom, part of the reason I think it's important to have at least an ordinance for the public to look at is so they have some guidelines as to a thought process. And so an example of that would be, Ted brought up the medical marijuana use, and then, we heard from somebody else, and then we talked about the cost, but there was a thought process through all that. If you just come and say, yeah, I think it should be sold or whatever, we should all be free to do that. To me, I want to hear more. As a person coming in with a public comment, why would you support this or why would you not? So they have a starting point of their thought process coming to us.
Well, the reason why I'd prefer to see an open, public meeting just to consider which way to go with it is because if we say, okay, the public meeting coming up next Tuesday is going to be for this ordinance, people are going to think, well, the option of banning it is already off the table. So we probably won't going to hear much about why they want to ban it.
Okay.
But if you approach it to, okay, which one would the public support the most? Or what are the arguments for either one? Well, then both options are still on the table.
So you
At
would
the
then
first
have to
public
let
meeting.
the public know that we want you to come in support of a license or a ban, Jonathan, or how would that be handled?
That's what I was gonna say, the wording.
Yes, and I definitely appreciate, Tom, Commissioner Kruger, your concern that the people coming wouldn't think that there's another option, but they need to know that there is another option. That's the whole purpose of a public meeting. And I agree with the county administrator. It is the cleaner way to do it, to have something in front of the public for them to say, I agree with this, but I disagree with certain parts, or I think it should be more restrictive, or we shouldn't do anything as a county. I think putting this in front of them, in front of the public, gives them the opportunity to have those discussions. And it would be cleaner than having just a blanket, we're gonna have a public meeting to talk about whether we should regulate this. I think this gives them a little bit better idea of what the options are, even though it's the middle of the three options, if you would.
Could you, Jonathan, just create like a one-page bullet point that if an ordinance was to go down the ban route, that it would just include items such as this that would be different than this, without writing the whole ordinance? Because we'll be forced to, if we go that route, we'll be forced to do that anyhow, because we'll have to have
Public
another
hearing
public
has to be specific to the ordinance language presented.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's a good opportunity for the public to voice what they would like to see, and whether or not they agree with this, or they'd like to see something different.
I think inherent in this, and the conversations that I've had in the community, presenting this would bring everybody to the table that had an opinion.
Yep.
And I don't think people would think that it's a foregone conclusion that something else isn't in consideration. But your public hearing notice does have to be restricted primarily to the language of the intended ordinance.
So would it be appropriate for Commissioner Kruger to say at the beginning of the public hearing, I would like to hear if you're in support of this, or if you're in support of a ban, or
That's absolutely, yeah.
I think you can generally, within the notice, talk about the scope of the proposed ordinance and get feedback from people on that, but you do have to address the scope of the proposed ordinance.
Which inherently does include, is this sufficient or is it
Yeah.
too much? Which is really what we're talking about here. Is it too restrictive or not restrictive enough? And that is, I think, inherent in this being a licensing ordinance. And I think the public will understand that they're coming on all sides saying, you know, this is how I personally feel about it as a citizen of the county, and that's the purpose of the meeting. So I think that to answer what you were talking about, Commissioner Krieger, is I hope that no one in the community thinks that this is a foregone conclusion. That is the purpose of a public meeting. The board cannot legally take action to pass a law, an ordinance, until it hears from the public. And so whatever the public says at that meeting will be taken into consideration, of course, by the commissioners.
If and when we set a public hearing date, I'd probably think it would be beneficial to do it after hours too.
Yes, I would agree with that.
It's a good idea.
And Mr. Chair, if I could, if we do a public hearing, I would invite all of you to come back and share. It's really important to hear, for the public to also, with your involvement in the community.
Thank you. That's all I had, unless you had any other questions.
Well, one thing I'd like to
Oh,
talk about is.
sure.
With tobacco, you know, I remember when it was just advertisement all over, sporting events, billboards, the whole ball of wax. And when that was banned, now the numbers of people using tobacco products and youth along with that has declined over the years. But now in America, we promote drug use. We're one of 2 countries in the world that allow pharmaceutical companies to market their product to the consumer.
I remember when that was banned too.
So if you watch a sporting event, whether it was the Vikings this weekend or whatever, every commercial break, they're selling alcohol or prescription drugs or over-the-counter drugs. And the nightly news, when I watch that, every commercial break, there's a drug sale. And nothing against the healthcare industry, but that's, you know, how they can make their money. But you see that the opioid settlement was a lot of pharmaceutical companies, you know, are paying billions of dollars because they were making a product and not really regulating it very much. And I kind of wonder, you know, if kids are watching any of these TV programs and they're seeing this promotion, if in some way, in my mind, does that also okay drug use? Whether, do they distinct between legal drugs and illegal drugs? You know, I don't know. So, and that's something we can't do as a county, ban advertising of prescription drugs or whatever, but I think that's contributing to the problem. And anybody else have any comments?
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you all for coming. So are we back on the budget, or?
I have a very few comments to make relative to the budget. One is, if you look through that PowerPoint that I shared with you, you can see how the county tax rate was up to 42% in 2018 and 2019, and now it's down to 33%, right? And I believe that a strategy of capturing 3% above the other real capacity growth will keep that percentage low, or actually even probably reducing a bit. The tax impacts, we reviewed that before. Those have actually come down a little bit because Kay's estimates have come down 0.5%. And you see the tax shift in the residential parcels. Those over $500,000 that are being taxed at 1.25 on that value over $500,000 are seeing a shift. They were going to see that shift if we had a zero impact, or zero levy this year, or even just a minor operational levy this year. The tax shift from the lower valued homes to the higher valued homes, as 74% of our tax capacity, residential, seasonal, and residential homes are gonna pay that share. And I think I've already kind of discussed some of the ideas relative to how we balance this and we get to the point of having sustainability in this budget. And the biggest thing is going to be being very deliberate about adding new positions and making sure that we're doing so with the right information and for the right reasons. So that's all I would throw out there. A lot of the materials that were handed out to you this morning was a one-page summary, and then the actual data related to the positions that were added, a copy of the levy history and the county tax rate. You got those actual tax impacts that I just talked about, and then you got a clean copy of the first-year capital plan. But my proposal would be we would take that to general government next week, and we would build that out for the first 5 years. And unless I hear different from that group, we'll kind of go one-third, 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 and using that capacity and figuring out how to work with that. But if, I would still be looking for ideas for specific economic development projects. I have a meeting with Mary coming up next week. The HLDC board will be meeting in 2 weeks. So we'll have some opportunity to populate those projects.
I'm glad this is in focus. On my
Oh,
mind-
yeah, on that, it was a picture, and the picture it pixelated on me, so.
I had to look over at Tom's, and his was the same way, so I'm thinking, okay, it's not just.
No, it
me.
wasn't you, it was the format. I was looking at a picture of a picture instead of actually the spreadsheet, so I couldn't zoom in without damaging the content.
I still got the idea.
That report will get very complicated and will be better to be seen on 11 by 17 paper than on any other type that we can print on, because it's gonna be a lot of numbers. But-
If there's nothing else, do we need a motion to adjourn?
Sure.
I'll move.
Thank you, Shar. And I'll second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.